Good evening, everyone. My name is Janet Hancock. I'm Acting Head of Public Services at the Public Record Office. Just wanted to welcome you all this evening on behalf of ourselves, PRONI, and the USIHS. A particular welcome to our guest speaker this evening, Dr. Elizabeth Dawson. I'm just going to quickly run through a little bit of housekeeping for everybody. The event has been recorded, so if anybody doesn't want to appear, if you would just switch your cameras off. You're all currently muted as well to keep background noise to a minimum. There is a Q&A at the end, so if anybody has any comments or questions, do put them in the chat as you go along, and our colleagues Andrew and Sophie will be taking forward the Q&A session towards the end of the programme. This is one of a programme of talks, and if you're interested in seeing what else is on in this collaborative programme, as well as PRONI's wider programme, do have a look on our website and sign up to our e-newsletter on the PRONI website. And I'm now going to pass you across to Andrew Snedden, who's going to take it from here.
Thank you very much, Janet. And just as you said, mute, my dog started barking, so it's a good thing. I just muted there as well. So welcome everybody, and thanks for coming along tonight. I'm Dr. Andrew Snedden, and I'm President of the Ulster Society for Irish Historical Studies. Along with our counterpart society in Dublin, we publish Irish Historical Studies, the journal, and we also throughout the year hold these talks. In a minute, they're all online with PRONI, and you can get them on the PRONI website, but you can also get them on our website as well. We'll stick details up in the chat function as we go along. As Janet said, our tonight's speaker is Dr. Elizabeth Dawson, and she has in the past lectured at UCD and Queen's University Belfast, and was Irish Research Council Fellow at the Royal Irish Academy. Dr. Dawson has published widely on the conversion to Christianity in the medieval West and the cults and lives of early Christian saints, and more pertinently for our talk, the development of Patrician cult from the 5th to 12th century. She's currently preparing a book, a monograph on Patrician Latin hagiography, which I think is out this year. So tonight's paper is entitled The Cult of St. Patrick and the Later Medieval Latin Lives. I'll pass you over to Dr. Dawson.
Brilliant, Andrew. Thanks so much. And thanks to Janet and Sophie also for inviting me to speak to all of you today. Yeah, so today I suppose what I want to talk to you about is a particular interest of mine, which is the cult of St. Patrick, and particularly St. Patrick's cult in the medieval period. So for a number of years, I suppose, I've worked on the hagiography, or the saints' lives, the biographies really, that are associated with Patrick's cult, and specifically the earliest lives of the saint, which were written by clerics named Muirchú and Tírechán in the 7th century. So about 200 or 250 years after Patrick probably died. And these are really kind of, texts that venerate St. Patrick and very much are about the legendary St. Patrick and the Saint Patrick rather than the real man Patrick. So when we think about the Patrick cult, the 7th century lives, really, they're the works that kind of come to mind, okay? And they're most often, kind of the barometer against which later iterations of the patrician cult are compared. And that's especially the case for the life by Muirchú, which is kind of the most famous and probably the most polished of the two lives. Now, more recently, my intention, however, has kind of been drawn to the later expressions of the patrician cult in the medieval period, and particularly to the Hiberno-Latin lives that followed the works by Muirchú and Tírechán. And I'm kind of especially interested in understanding how and why Patrick and his cult were afforded such longevity, and ultimately why the saint gained such a unique and an expansive status. So Sophie, I'll just get you to move on to the next slide there. Sophie is very nicely moving through the slides for me because we had a bit of a problem with me sharing my screen. So thanks to Sophie for that. So these are the lives that I'm going to speak to you about today. They're known as the Vita Tertia, the Vita Secunda, and the Vita Quarta. Now, these are lives that are really rarely considered. Okay, and I'll go through the reasons for that, you know, in a moment. But to my mind, at least, they've really been unfairly dismissed by scholars in the past. So the lives, Vita Tertia, it's an anonymous life. It's importantly, and I'll probably repeat this quite a bit through this talk, it's the most copied patrician life from the medieval period, which I suppose tells us a huge amount, and perhaps we need to give that a little bit more attention. And then we also have the lives Vita Secunda and Vita Quarta, which are related texts. I'll kind of talk about them in a related manner. They're kind of twins almost, but are also, you know, we don't know who wrote them. They're also anonymous lives. They're related because we know that they probably derive from a now lost text about St. Patrick, which is commonly known as W. So an earlier life, and then they've kind of deviated off into their own little particular, you know, I suppose, ways, but they're still quite related at the same time. Sophie, I'll just get you to move on to the next slide, please. Thanks so much. Now, while saints such as Patrick and even, in fact, Bridget have received attention from scholars, I think it's fair to say, with some quite important exceptions, that the early medieval nexus of these cults has really been a focus, okay? And less consideration has really been given to change within these traditions. Now, this is especially evident in the case of the patrician cult, where attention has tended to focus on two, you know, probably three areas. So the first area would be St. Patrick's own writings in the 5th century, then those earliest lives that I just mentioned by Muraku and Tyrconnell, and then to some extent as well, attention has been given to Jocelyn's life of St. Patrick, which is produced in the 12th century. But while all of these aspects of the cult are important, a reconsideration of the early dossier in its totality allows for an extended appreciation of the cult. So, you know, I suppose the main thing that I'm trying to get here is that Patrick's saintly status really was sustained and then also reimagined over time with the active engagement of successive generations. Now, in the case of the patrician cult, it was not the lives written in the 7th century that were most copied in the medieval period, but rather the extended narrative, that Colgan called Vita Tertia. And this is a life that makes use of those earlier traditions, but which expanded upon them considerably. Now, the dissemination of the patrician lives across the continent, okay, because these are lives that survive across the continent in various different manuscripts. This kind of points not just to the movement of Irish peregrini, so Irish clerics who are moving to the continent, but also the interaction of non-Irish Christians with the cult. Now, the development also of the vernacular Irish corpus in the medieval period adds a further dimension to our appreciation of how Patrick's story evolved and the ways in which authors of his biography created and melded kind of these seemingly, you know, quite different traditions. So we have a life, an Irish life, the 9th century Vita Tripartita of Patrick, or probably 9th century. It's predominantly written in Irish, but it includes some Latin passages. And it's a life that really kind of demonstrates that the traditions, all of these traditions I'm kind of talking about it, were kind of far from isolated, but depended on and even engaged with each other in varying different ways. But while we can be certain that the cult of Patrick expanded greatly from the 7th century onwards, so after those lives written by Muraku and Tyrconnell, the cultural and the intellectual avenues through which this occurred are really far from clear. How the various literary branches of the cult evolved is uncertain, and it's difficult to say whether they were part of one great enterprise, whether they were loosely connected, or whether aspects of this tradition aspects were entirely separated. Whatever the case may be, the diversification of the cult, as well as the fact that the saint gained a more expansive narrative, demonstrates that his saintly tradition was embedded and evolved as part of multiple communities. The Latin Lives provide an opportunity, and I would say probably one of our best opportunities, to appreciate how Patrick's cult developed after the 7th century, but there are significant problems. Now, the writers of the Lives remain unknown, and attempts to ascertain their composition dates have proved difficult. So we have dates ranging anywhere from the 8th century all the way up to the 11th century for these lives. And really, it's unlikely that we'll be able to place these lives more precisely. But I think one of the things we do have to do when we have sources like this, and it's not unusual in the medieval period, that we can't actually place, precisely date and place the context of certain texts. So really what we need to do is we need to start looking at these texts and perhaps asking different questions. Okay, I'll get you to go to the next slide, Sophie, if that's okay. Okay, so these lives, Vita Secunda, Vita Tertia, Vita Quarta, these are the lives that Colgan included in his Trias Thaumaturga in 1647. And they're really the lives that influenced understandings of the saint in the early modern period. Indeed, it's the names of the lives themselves were given to the works by the Franciscan friar, who you see here in the fresco on this slide. So for early modern scholars, such as Colgan, the works were a core and a central element of the patrician story. Now, the Louvain scheme that brought about these publications set out to preserve and to bring together as much material as possible. However, the lives by Moraku and Tyrconnell are notably absent. Colgan was aware of their existence through Usher's 1639 Britannicarum Ecclesiarium Antiquitates, but clearly he didn't have copies or access to copies of either life. Now, of course, this demonstrates the difficulties that he and his collaborators faced when compiling their work, but it also tells us something about early modern knowledge of the cult. The lives that were available to Colgan were included in his endeavour. So the fact that Vita Secunda, Vita Tertia and Vita Quarta were appreciated for their contribution to Patrick's biography and that copies of the texts were traced is indicative of their influence on the patrician narrative. Now, unfortunately, these lives have been afforded little attention by modern scholars, even though they played a central role in medieval and early modern understandings of Patrick's biography. Now, this is likely because of the complicated preservation of the works, which leave many seminal questions unanswered. So the kind of things I've already mentioned, like authorship, date range, place of production. But it's also the result of the focus on the origins of Patrick's legend, following what was kind of seen as a rediscovery of the first, of Moraku's life, the 7th century lives. And that comes about in 1847 here with the first published edition of Moraku's life by Sir William Betham in 1827. Now, this focus on this early work was coupled with an assumption with the later lives, and in particular, this is the Latin works, so it doesn't necessarily relate to the tripartite life, the Irish life that I mentioned, but particularly these Hiberno-Latin works, that they were kind of seen as of having very little literary merit, and that they really just merely expanded upon a tradition that was already established by the earlier patrician hagiographers Tyrconnell and Moraku. And this is kind of presented in almost that these writers of the later lives are kind of working in this kind of linear and quite unimaginative way. So the later lives remained a feature of the scholarship in some ways, but they were really just appreciated as kind of legendary extensions of the earlier texts. Now, I think a great example of this is Beeler's treatment. So Ludwig Beeler, who's the great editor of patrician texts in the 20th century, Beeler in his 1949 work treats the hagiographical lives quite differently. So in his Life and Legend of St. Patrick, dated to 1949, he makes this kind of clear differentiation between the patrician hagiographies. So when he assesses the 7th century works by Muirchú and Tírechán, he entitles his chapter, and this is chapter 4, he calls it The Real St. Patrick, the Evidence of the Lives. And then later in his dossier, he discusses in chapter 5, the later lives, so Vita Secunda, Tertia and Quarta, and he entitles that chapter A Literary History of the Patrick Legend. So like really clearly defining between these hagiographical works. Now, similarly, and probably, something that's been a little bit more influential on the way in which these texts have been treated, in his 1971 edition of the later works, he didn't actually he didn't undertake his project with the intention of kind of developing further scholarship in the immediate area. But rather what he did was he edited these later lives in order to inform his later enterprise, which was that he wanted to reconstruct the earliest lives, the life of Muirchú, or the life of Patrick by Muirchú, the 7th century work. So what he was trying to do was he was using the later works to inform his next enterprise, which was focusing on those 7th century texts. And the reason for that is really that Muirchú's life only survives in a small number of manuscripts, and these later lives incorporate material from the earlier tradition. And so he was using them basically to bolster his evidence base there. Now, in addition to all of this, the ongoing scholarly debates in Irish history over the 20th century, so those kind of nativist, anti-nativist approaches, they were ongoing, and they were very important in terms of detangling the kind of the 5th century Patrick from his legendary persona. But what they did was they did little for considerations of the cult in its entirety. Now, these developments highlighted kind of the edifying and the political nature of hagiography and led to an appreciation of Patrick the Saint within his proper historical context. So very necessary, developments. But while the earliest patrician lives, particularly Muirchú's life, have received some attention as part of this reassessment, Vita Secunda, Tertia and Quarta, yet again, have not garnered the same interest, and they've actually been especially neglected. So even with Beeler's edition in 1971, a flurry of scholarship did not follow, which is kind of perhaps not particularly surprising given the editor's kind of own view on the works. So, if you just go down there, I have a quote from Beeler, not a particularly helpful quote. This is a quote from Beeler. This comes from the very first page, actually, of the edition in his preface. And he clearly lays out what he thinks about these sources. He says, as sources for the life of their hero, they have no independent value. As documents illustrating the growth of the Patrick legend, they have a limited interest in those sections which are not taken over from earlier texts still in existence. So this is his kind of interest in using these lives to reconstruct earlier works, okay? And then just the killer line, he says, as hagiographic literature, they do not rank very high. So you can see why maybe Beeler's edition didn't instill much confidence in scholars to, kind of pick up the baton and start looking at these texts. Sophie, I might just get you to go back up to the slide before, sorry, just to confuse you now. Now, after Beeler and his edition in 1971, it's actually not until 1994 when Francis John Byrne and Pádraig Francis published their translation of Vita Secunda and Quarta that any singular attention was given to the lives. But again, unfortunately, little happened in the aftermath of this translation. And in actual fact, Francis John Byrne and Pádraig Francis did lay out in their introduction to that translation that they felt there was scope for additional work on these lives, but it just never transpired. So little or no thought has therefore been given to the creativity of this group of lives and their anonymous writers, or the important engagement that existed between patrician devotees and their saint in expanding, redefining, and even stabilizing aspects of the saint's legacy. Sophie, I'll just get you to pop down to, the one below, exactly. Okay, so before I kind of move on to looking at these lives, these important lives that I've talked about, I suppose it's important to consider, the earlier lives and the tradition that happens before them, just to kind of situate ourselves. Now, here I've kind of just listed what we know in terms of the patrician cult, so the actual texts that are available to us for that earlier strata of the cult. And so I'm sure many of you would be familiar that in the 5th century, we have, two writings ascribed to St. Patrick. They are his Confessio and his Epistola ad Paraticum, both texts, kind of dated to the 5th century. Probably less known are the kind of fragmentary pieces that we find in later lives from an individual called Ultan. Ultan is referred to in Tiracon's Life of St. Patrick, and we're told that Ultan is somebody who had a book of, I suppose, we're not really sure what, but he had some kind of book relating to St. Patrick and about St. Patrick. Possibly he penned it himself. He certainly seems to have been an individual who was involved in the writing of saints' lives early in the 7th century. Now, in terms of texts proper that we then have these big two lives, the lives by Tircon and by Muraku, both written in the kind of late 7th century, and both texts that are, very much concerned with how Patrick converts the island, but in very different ways. They're kind of complementary texts, even though they're quite different. So Tircon is a writer who, kind of presents this kind of circular or circuit for Patrick as he travels around the island. Really, he kind of only travels to southern Inal territory, goes to Tara, and then he focuses in on Connacht. And, we get lots and lots of stories about Connacht. And what Tircon does is, in terms of his understanding of conversion, what he presents for the reader is kind of very much focuses on Patrick as a bishop. And he suggests that Patrick, founds churches, establishes essentially an institutional church. So he's talking about a church where, he leaves individuals. So he founds churches, he leaves a cleric there, and he moves on, and he does the same elsewhere. And so that's kind of Tircon's view of conversion. Muraku, on the other hand, is probably someone who's writing, almost certainly someone who's writing from Armagh. And what he does is he's not so much concerned with kind of really, bedding down lots and lots of traditions about St. Patrick in the same way as Tircon is, but rather he's very interested in creating, kind of a seamless narrative. And he is the individual who creates this great narrative about Patrick that focuses on Tara and Patrick's defeat of the Druids and the king, in fact, at Tara. And through those big kind of events, we see then that the island is converted to Christianity. Okay, so these are two very, very important texts, both preserved in the 9th century Book of Armagh, which you see in this image here. Now, following that, we kind of don't really know after the 7th century precisely how the patrician cult develops in terms of the writings that we have. Okay, we do have some fragmentary pieces that are also preserved in the Book of Armagh, but they're not extensive. Okay, and they don't give us kind of a full idea of how the patrician cult and the writings associated with St. Patrick, particularly these narratives, how they're actually kind of formed or how they come about. Really, it's these lives that I'm talking about today, the Vita Tertia, Secunda, Quarta. These are the ones that give us our greatest insight into how that, Patrick's persona develops. Okay, Sophie, I'll get you to just move on to the next slide. Thank you. Sorry, a day of lecturing. My voice is kind of going a little bit, so apologies for that. Okay, now, unlike the lives that are written by Muraku and by Tyracon, whose compositions are preserved in what is very close to their own original, the later patrician works, particularly Vita Secunda and Quarta, those twin lives, do not exist in their earliest form. Rather, the lives as we find them today demonstrate that they were active texts which were frequently copied and they were subject to change. Now, this is evident not just from the extensive number of manuscripts that preserve them, but also from the multiple recensions and the often confused structures of some of the versions that survive. And no doubt this is really the result of, scribal error and mismanagement over time. Now, as a body of evidence, the works are therefore unique witnesses to the vitality and also the advancement of patrician devotion in the medieval period, both in Ireland and abroad. Now, an examination of the manuscript traditions of Vita Secunda, Tertia and Quarta is no easy task. Vita Secunda and Quarta, as I mentioned, are considered separate lives, but they derive from the same exemplar known as W. And while Vita Tertia contains some common material with these works, so we kind of see these works kind of fusing together in different manuscripts, it's actually Vita Tertia is part of a separate tradition, even though those kind of fusions happen at different times. So a number of manuscripts combine elements of the two traditions. The best example of this is the preservation of the Vita Secunda preface in versions of the Vita Tertia text. All right. So what this really tells us is that some of the scribes and the communities who preserved these works on the continent, therefore, what they did was they sought to kind of meld material that they had together, that they sought to add to the writings that they already had in their possession. So really, it's a kind of a clear example of the development of the tradition, both inside and outside of Ireland as well. That the texts were copied in non-Irish circles is obvious from the frequent errors in Irish spellings, so the spellings of Irish personal names, of place names, and even of quite specific Latin hibernoisms that are a feature of many Irish manuscripts. Most of the manuscripts that preserve the works date later than the 12th century, and in some instances as late as the 17th century. So plenty of time for lots of errors to occur within these texts. Vita Secunda and Quarta, the two texts are connected, they're considered twins, and as I mentioned, they derive from this common exemplar. Now together, Vita Secunda and Quarta represent two strands of a shared common original, W. And this W is also a text that was influential on the Irish life I mentioned earlier, the Vita Tripartita. They based some of their work on this W text. Vita Quarta, as you can see here, is the longest of the texts. So Vita Secunda is kind of, only goes up to a certain point. There's 24 chapters altogether. It's kind of truncated. And then we have Vita Quarta, which kind of extends the narrative then, and you get 97 chapters altogether. Even though it's longer, Vita Quarta appears though to be the kind of newer of the texts. It doesn't seem, it's more removed from its original. So Vita Secunda appears to represent a more archaic version of the textual tradition. Now these texts, the Vita Secunda and Quarta texts, I should say, all date in range from the 11th to the 17th century. Now, a difficulty in approaching these particular two works is ascertaining the point at which they split and that they deviated from their original W to become two separate works. So a few certainties are kind of worth stating. First, W was the product of an Irish author, and this is especially, obvious in the relationship that exists between Vita Secunda, Quarta, and then that Irish tripartite life as well. So they're all kind of connected in terms of their inclusion of some shared traditions and stories. But we can also tell that this, ultimately the life was written in Ireland because of the obvious Irish focus of the content, as well as the inclusion of Irish personal names and of Irish place names. Now, as to whether Vita Secunda and Quarta in their kind of current forms were separate entities before they travelled outside of Ireland, that really is something that is far more difficult to determine. Now, in terms of Vita Tertia, as I mentioned before, it is the most copied of all the Patrician Lives, and given the geographical spread of the manuscripts in which it's found, it appears to have been more widely distributed than any other Patrician life. So as such, it made a significant impact on appreciations of the saint's biography in the medieval period and beyond. The Irish origins of the life are again evident in the use of Irish proper names, but also in the author's reference to the island. So he calls it this island, he says Haik Insula, and so kind of a clear indication that this is somebody who is writing about the island that they're on. That changes were made to the life after it was brought to England is clear from its two recensions. I've given you a picture here actually of Glastonbury, where there is a centre of, a cult centre for St. Patrick. And it is kind of assumed that it is through Glastonbury that many of these texts would have travelled and been preserved. So the Vita Tertia text, we kind of know that it was brought to England, and there's two recensions of the life. Beeler is the one who was able to identify these recensions. So one is a continental recension. What we call the continental recension was given the signum gamma by Beeler, and the other one pi, which is the English recension. So there are two different recensions, and I suppose they've kind of got different distinctive features. They're kind of, basically it's the same life, but it really what you get is in, the continental recension, you get things like the inclusion of some of the Vita Secunda material starts coming into it. So we know that there's a melding of some of these lives once they leave Ireland. So again, it's clear that non-Irish contributors to the patrician cult were now influential on the development of the tradition and how it was received by different people on the continent. Now, a further and even excellent example of this is then the reintroduction back into Ireland of Vita Tertia. So the Vita Tertia material, after it left Ireland and a number of changes were made to it, returned to Ireland in what is now a non-extant, so a no longer existing life, which we know about because of the writings of James Ussher, James Ware, and Geoffrey Keating, who all refer to and quote from a text that they called the Opus Tripartitum. So again, we're seeing a kind of a development here in terms of, we can appreciate that these lives are leaving the island, that they are being worked upon elsewhere, that they're returning as well, even to Ireland. So, really showing that there is multiple communities who are influencing the cult of Patrick and how Patrick is understood. Now, the complications of the contextual evidence has meant, of course, that scholars have shied away from examining the later Latin lives in any real robust way. Indeed, when considering the expansion of the patrician narrative after the 7th century, preference is often given to the extended, but the ostensibly later vernacular tripartite life over the Latin material. So what we see is that, when reference is made to the traditions that exist in all of these lives and that built up over time, it's very often the tripartite life that's referred to rather than, Vita Tertia or Vita Secunda and Quarta, even though the traditions that are found in those may well be a better indication of an earlier version of these traditions. Now, Certainly the tripartite life, it has to be said, preserves some of these traditions, some of the same traditions. But what we do also have to remember is that these lives, the Irish life and then the later Latin lives, are not wholly homogeneous texts. Their structures, their audiences, and their presentations of Patrick differ really quite considerably. So the simple fact is that we just have not been asking the right questions of the material that is available to us. Okay, Sophie, I'll just get you to go to the next slide there. That's great. Of the surviving Hiberno-Latin Lives, Vita Tertia is often considered to have the most to offer in terms of originality and detail. Now, very few people have worked on these lives, so I think that really remains open to debate. Now, the work itself is the longest of the texts and survives in the greatest number of manuscript copies, which I've mentioned about 20 times at this stage, but it's worth saying again. What's more, it is a text that appears closer to its original than the other surviving lives. And you will come to see this when I discuss it in a moment. The writer of the life demonstrates really quite a strong awareness of the extant writings concerning the saint, and specifically the lives by Muraku and by Tyrconnell, but also Patrick's Confessio and his Epistola. And that's actually quite noteworthy because the Epistola does not appear in either Muraku or Tyrconnell in any clear sense anyway. But clearly the Vita Tertia author was aware of the Epistola. He certainly has an interest in the North, and I think that probably suggests that he has a particular kind of affiliation with the region. Perhaps surprisingly, while it is kind of the most copied version of or copied patrician work on the continent, unlike the other lives that survive, and this includes the tripartite life as well, it doesn't actually develop a story of Patrick's childhood outside of Ireland. Rather, what it does is it follows the same template that's set down by Muraku and Tyrconnell, and it begins Patrick's life at the time of his captivity, so basically at the age of 16. In terms of structure, I suppose the life is kind of an amalgamation of the earlier 7th century works. That's absolutely the case, but there are additions to it. But we shouldn't just look at it simply as kind of, a melding of traditions. There's actually some thought process that actually goes into creating this life. So there's kind of a mastery that occurs in the way that the writer actually melds all of this material together. So it's worth kind of stating that despite the writer's adherence to previous models, the life is demonstrably, I suppose, innovative. It includes new material, but in addition to all of this, it's actually, it changes the emphasis as well of certain elements that we found in the earlier lives themselves. And I think this is kind of the seminal point as to why these lives should be given additional, thought, which is that, even though they may be, rehashing the same material or using the same source base, they're actually changing it in ways that suits their particular needs. So just on this slide, I suppose it's kind of worth emphasizing, particularly because the lives are accused of being kind of mere extensions of what came before them, that the author does actually make some very conscious decisions about how they want Patrick to be presented. So I think one of the best examples of this is, the fusion of Muraku and Tyrconnell and how the Vita Tertia author fuses these two authors. It seems that they may be, they could potentially be, one of the first authors to have done so. But what they do is, this particular author, what they do is they kind of fuse elements that they want to fuse together, and then they don't with others. So a really great example of that is the story of King Loigera at Tara, which is that big story I mentioned, which Muraku in the 7th century kind of creates in a very fluid way. It's a really big, significant story for Patrick, where he comes to Tara, where he meets the Druids, he defeats them through various different miraculous feats. And then at the end, King Loigra, the High King of Ireland, says that he doesn't want necessarily to convert, but that he will, because he knows that otherwise he will die. Now, we do have another version of that story, a much shorter one in Tyrocon's 7th century life, in which Tyrcon says, yes, the Druids were defeated, but actually that the king did not convert because he says he wanted to be buried with his ancestors in his ancestral way. What the Vita Tertia author does, which is quite interesting, is they begin their Tara story. They very much follow Muraku. So they follow that kind of narrative that Muraku has created in an edited way, but they follow it through. They even use some of the same terminology that Muraku uses. But right at the end, Tyrcon, or sorry, I should say Loigra, does not actually convert. So what the Vita Tertia author does is he kind of refers back to that other tradition where, you know, Loigra actually does not convert to Christianity. So this is kind of a conscious decision that must be being made on the part of the author. And similarly, the structure, you know, again, is reminiscent of Tyrcon. So there's a broad kind of geographical structure to the Vita Tertia, in the same way that Tyrcon would have done that kind of circuit where he calls it a circuit, but he just kind of moves over to Connacht. The Vita Tertia author does something very, very similar, which involves a more extended circuit. So it involves Munster, Connacht, and then the north of the island as well. Leinster just gets a little bit of a look in. But what the Vita Tertia author is doing is he's using these Muraku stories, and Muraku doesn't base his life on this kind of geographical structure. He does it in a more narrative way, I suppose. But he takes Muraku stories, but then he embeds those types of stories into Tyrcon's general structure. Okay, so again, we need to look at these lives more clearly and kind of really get to grasp what the authors are doing here, because they create quite a different emphasis and sometimes unexpected emphases as well. Sophie, I'll just get you to go to the next slide there. So just in terms of expansion and redirection, I kind of just wanted to kind of hit on some of the elements of these lives that are particularly noteworthy in terms of what they do to create new aspects or extend aspects of the earlier patrician tradition. So I've just mentioned a few things. In terms of expansion, if we look at expansion in the Vita Tertia, one of the things we get is we get that fusion of Muraku and Tyrcon. Something we're kind of very used to when we look at the lives. We often think of Patrick in terms of, oh, Muraku, Tyrcon, and them going hand in hand, but these are separate writers, and really what the Vita Tertia has done, if it is, or at least shows us, is that communities in Ireland were fusing those traditions together in different ways. Okay, so that is quite important. And we see things like Patrick's, kind of backstory being extended. So we don't get a childhood story for Patrick in Vita Tertia, but what we do get is a strong development of his credentials. So not only does he travel, to the continent of Gaul, but he also travels to Rome. We see, kind of this association with Rome being formalized more fully. So for example, Patrick is sent to the Irish by Pope Celestine. Okay, so it's kind of been given, his traveling to Ireland as a missionary has been given this sanction by Rome. But we also get things like an extension of the materiality of the cult. That's coming through very strongly in Vita Tertia in particular, and also of pilgrimage. So I've just given you a picture here of St. Patrick's Bell and the later shrine that is at the National Museum of Ireland. And bells are kind of objects that are very much associated with St. Patrick in the medieval period. But you do get in Vita Tertia, you get additional stories. So for example, we see the introduction of, the famous staff of Jesus that Patrick is said to have been in possession of. And you also get stories as well about Patrick's Bell. So these are also evident in Vita Tertia. And in actual fact, you get other kind of materiality, or materials mentioned. So for example, the Vita Tertia author, despite giving us very little references to his, the sources that he's using, we do know he does tell us that that there are about 60 odd extant writings about St. Patrick at the time that that he's writing. Now, in addition to that kind of expansion that we also get redirection in the life. And this is one of the things that really shows us how, I suppose, how important these lives are and what we can garner from them in terms of how we appreciate the patrician cult. Now, the emphases on particular individuals is a great example of this. So I already kind of mentioned Loigra there and the fact that he doesn't convert, even though the author is clearly using Muraku. But we also see a kind of a rebalancing of the individuals within the life and the narrative set pieces, as opposed to what came before. So before, let's say in Muraku's text, Tara is a core element of that text. The conversion of Loigra is essentially a kind of a one-fits-all conversion of Ireland, as it were. But that is not the case in Vita Tertia. So in Vita Tertia, Loigra has kind of, the actual Tara section itself is given far less attention, but actually what you get is attention given to other characters or individuals who are mentioned in some of the earlier lives. And in particular, you get a kind of a reassessment of some of those characters. So Deku, who is meant to have been one of the first converts of St. Patrick, he is someone who is completely reinvented in Vita Tertia. He's no longer, he was in Muraku a swineherd, someone of very little standing. But for the Vita Tertia author, Deku has become a giant, and he is in possession of land, which he then gifts to Patrick. And he becomes such an important individual that even, as Patrick is nearing death, one of his requests is, he requests of an angel that Deku and his, his family, that they are given, particular status after his death. And we see, this kind of change in terms of how particular characters are treated, and we see that throughout the life. We also see kind of the introduction of things like the Munster traditions, and so kind of that extension of Tíreachán's geographical structure. And probably something that's not entirely surprising is we get a re-emphasis in terms of how conversion is, understood. So conversion isn't as important, probably reflecting the time at which this life is kind of written. And also the reasons for conversion are kind of changed a little bit. So we see lots of miracles in relation to why people convert. So they're not converting because Patrick is preaching to them, but we get examples, let's say, of them converting because they've been resurrected, or in some cases because they're promised good looks or long life or something along those lines. Now I'm just kind of conscious of time. I'll move on to the next slide, and I'll move on to Vita Secunda and Vita Quarta quite quickly. What I will say about these lives is that they're not as straightforward as Vita Tertia. Vita Tertia presents, I think, quite a more thought out scheme, and it's probably because of the way in which it's actually been preserved as opposed to the intentions of the author originally. Okay, Vita Secunda and Quarta are lives that simply are just further removed from their original. So they're really not straightforward in terms of appreciating the underlying structure and so on. But in saying this, they're very, very important lives because they do give us an insight into an expansion of Patrick's biography, and that expansion is back into his childhood. So as you can see here, I've mentioned that Vita Secunda, I've divided them up just so you get an idea of how they're kind of divided, but I'll be treating them together in terms of drawing some conclusions. So Vita Secunda kind of starts, it gives us a generally chronological structure. It starts with Patrick's childhood. This is really developed in the Vita Secunda and also in Vita Quarta. His childhood, he's given, a foster mother. We get, stories of his baptism. You can see kind of a later depiction of that story here. But in Vita Secunda, we have an ending, not at the point at which Patrick dies, but at the end of the Tara story. It's very much after the kind of childhood sections, which are new. It's very much a life that's based on Muraku and some of those individual conversion stories that I mentioned. And we do know that it depends on certain sources. Muraku is an obvious one. There's also quite a number of quotes from the Confessio being included here. So again, that early writing of St. Patrick is still really quite important to those who are presenting Patrick's biography. Those 5th century writings are still quite important. I'll just move on to the next slide there. Thanks, Sophie. So Vita Quarta then is the extension of Vita Secunda. Again, we have a broad chronological structure. It starts again, we get those stories about Patrick's childhood, and then moves on to end with his death. Now, in terms of sources, again, in a similar fashion to Vita Secunda, we have Muraku, we can see Tyricon in there, the Confessio, and then there is this other source that we can see is being used, and that's Vita Prima Sanctae Brigitte, which is a life of St. Bridget. There's arguments over when it was actually written, whether it's a 7th century or perhaps an 8th century life. There's also unidentifiable sources in there, which again just kind of points to the complexity of how these lives are preserved. But kind of what I want to focus on here is that inclusion of Vita Prima. So this is in the Vita Quarta text. The fact that Vita Prima is included here probably suggests that this extension to Vita Secunda, that later bit of the life, is something that obviously is created in Ireland. It's speculative, but it's a good indicator that this is somebody in Ireland who's producing this life. It also probably suggests that this is somebody who's probably not from the traditional centres that we might associate with St. Patrick, so somewhere like Armagh. Again, it's speculative, but Vita Prima is a text that itself, even though it's a life of St. Bridget, did include a number of sections about St. Patrick, and was probably written in an area, a southern Anale area, where there was influence from the north, as well as maybe embedded traditions about St. Bridget. So the Vita Quarta author, or the author of W perhaps, is drawing on those traditions. And, that tradition is particularly developed. Sophie, I'll just get you to go to the next slide there. So in terms of how that is developed, one big difference in the Vita Quarta is the fact that Patrick's big burial story, which we find in Muraku's life, we also see it in Vita Tertia, and involves Patrick basically saying, I really want to be buried at Armagh, but an angel comes and tells him, well, I'm sorry, you can't go there, even though you love that city so much, you actually have to, go to Saul. So, it's a very well-known story about St. Patrick, and one that very much is seen as a story that bolsters the importance of Armagh, but it is notably absent from Vita Quarta. And in actual fact, what happens in Vita Quarta is that as Patrick nears his death, we get a number of these stories from Vita Prima, and particularly in relation to a story where Bridget is supposed to have made Patrick's death shroud. So what happens is Patrick asks for his death shroud. It is brought to him. And again, Bridget kind of appears and is very much associated with the saint. So what this would suggest is that perhaps what we have here is a life that is not centered on Armagh. It focuses on, venerating Patrick, and, perhaps it's just kind of another way in which Patrick was appreciated in Ireland and outside of Ireland as well. Now, in terms of expansion, we obviously get, that kind of full chronological order for the saint. So the kind of thing we'd expect from many saints' lives. So we get from birth to death is what's presented in the Vita Secunda, Vita Quarta. Okay. But what we also get is we get this introduction of kind of new native type miracles. So for example, Patrick is given a foster mother, and really we're kind of getting these kind of miracles that relate to, miracles of plenty, where he's, producing food, he has a foster mother, he has kind of all of these elements that we would expect to see kind of in an Irish saint's life. So I would say that that is something that's particularly noteworthy from the Vita Secunda, Vita Tertia tradition. So I'm just kind of running through this a little bit, but if anyone has any questions, you can ask me at the end. So yeah, Sophie, you can just run on to the next one. So I suppose really what I've tried to do here is just give you some examples of how the lives function individually, which I think is very important. And I think it's clear that they each present a different view of Patrick, much in the same way as the lives of Muraku and Turrican did before them. Now, we can draw many conclusions from these individual studies, but as a collective, the texts show that the cult, even before the 12th century, was not a static entity that survived really on the coattails of these 7th century lives that I've mentioned. Rather, it appears that a continual and a robust process of engagement was ongoing after the 7th century. Moving forward, I suppose what I would kind of suggest is that it's only through this kind of long durée of patrician veneration that the phenomenon of Patrick and his cult can be more clearly appreciated. Thanks very much, and apologies if I've gone over a little bit.